Kia ora and welcome back to Whakarongo, the podcast representing the voices of thousands of rangatahi in state care. My name is Sydney Ann, and after marching to Parliament last year calling on the government to uphold 6 promises relating to our basic rights, this year we're talking to the young people affected by those promises being broken. The second is a promise made to Ihorangi Reweti Peters.
You promised to provide me with safety and stability.
Since growing up in state care, Ihorangi has been a stern voice for change, advocating for mandatory free mental health support for care experienced young people, and spoke about his experience at the Royal Commission of Inquiry into Abuse in Care. Kia ora Ihorangi, firstly thank you so much for opening up and sharing your story with us. I wanted to start off by asking you about your early years in care and what that was like.
Essentially was raised by my grandparents. I came into tamariki care when I was 10 because of my behavioural and mental health problems. I was bounced around from pillar to post while I was in tamariki care. Had about 7 or 8 different placements, with my longest being my grandparents, and the shortest, which was 10 years, and the shortest being 24 hours.
Oh, wow. So before the age of 10, you were...
Before the age of 10, I was living with my grandparents, from the age of 7 months until 10.
Yeah. And then you were just being a little bit naughty, like behavioural issues. Or not naughty, that's like a bad way to say it. And then at age 10, OT got involved?
Yeah, well, OT got involved when essentially they uplifted me and my siblings from my mum at 7 months old.
Right.
But I wasn't officially in the care of the state until I was 10.
Okay. And then what was that placement looking like? Because I know you still have ongoing relationship with your grandparents. So like from age of 10 till, let's say now, or when you turned 18, you were moved a lot?
Yeah, moved a lot, but I still had the connection with my grandparents.
Yeah. Okay. Like for you, like if you look back now, like moving around so much, what do you think that impact was for you?
The biggest issue was trust, being able to trust people, and I guess no sense of safety. There was not really, I guess I could be moved at any time.
Yeah.
So I never really found a home, I guess, until I went to live with my previous caregivers, where that was more of a home environment compared to any other place that I had been, because it wasn't tamariki run. It was an NGO provider who provided the care.
If you think about your grandparents, and like, what do you think they did for you that made you feel safe and have stability in your life?
Their whānau. They were the ones that raised me from when I was a baby. They were the ones that provided me with love, nurture, and stability.
Yeah. I have to ask this, you know, because you were living with them until you were age 10. Was there ever a moment where, like, because they'd had you until you were 10, that you felt any sort of way that you had to go into care from your grandparents?
Of course, that was always in the back of my mind, that I really wanted to stay and live with them. But I guess when I was younger, my behavioural, I was very violent and angry towards my grandparents, and other people. So while I didn't show, but I always knew that it was probably better for me to be in care compared to living full-time with my grandparents. But I always wanted to, but I knew that.
So it was like the better arrangement.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we talked a little bit about this earlier, but what do you think that impact on your ability to like trust people or confidence in yourself has been from being in care?
When you are taken away from the people that you love the most and thrown into an environment where you are there with complete strangers, people you don't know or people who don't love you, I guess that impacts your own well-being.
Yeah.
Well, it does impact your own well-being, but for me it impacted many different parts of my well-being. It impacted my mental health, my physical health, but also my ability to trust and care for other people. And it also threw my confidence entirely. I don't know what caused me to have or not trust people, but I'm pretty certain it was being let down by the state and the people who are supposed to care and protect us.
Yeah.
But in my case, in many other cases, Orangi Tamariki hasn't.
Yeah. So this is something that I think a lot of us will have in common from being in care. But do you remember those moments where you were being told that you were going to move? And like, how did that feel? How did that go down for you? Because I have my own experience of those conversations, but like, what is it that triggers that response to you? Because like, if someone says to me, hey, like, we need to talk, it triggers me to be like, oh my God, I'm being kicked out, I'm moving on.
I think it still haunts me today. It's either that fight or flight response. I'm ready to run and get the hell out of there.
Yeah.
And my heart is pounding. Or I'm ready to have a fight.
Yeah. My motto is always like, I'd rather say goodbye to you on my terms than you kick me out, because like, how many times were we told like, hey, so you're moving on Saturday, and you're like, what did I do wrong?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's still, there are memories that will never leave from my experience being in care, but always it will be, if someone says, hey, I need to talk to you, it will always be my heart will be pounding.
It's so true. And like nearly every care experience person I talk to, it's the same. Like, you can't just say to us, hey, can we talk? Or I need to talk to you. It has to be like, if you're going to message me that, like, tell me what you want to talk about.
Exactly.
So I know that it's not, you're getting rid of me.
Yeah.
But that's so sad though, hey, like, that so many of us have that response, because I would imagine that most people can have that, like, hey, can we chat? Or I need to talk to you, and not have that immediate, like, fear response of, like, I need to run away or I need to fight you.
Yeah. And I think it's something that we need to, or a stigma that's associated, that we need to break from being in care. I guess maybe outside people or people who haven't experienced being in care will just think that it's anxiety, or there's nothing wrong with being anxious, but really we need to look at what the whole picture, what has actually happened to that young person. Why are they anxious? Why do they have that fight or flight response constantly? And
like, what do you think is the solution for that? Like, how do you think we stop that for future generations?
Obviously, there's a need for a care and protection system, whether that be led by iwi or government or whānau, hapu or iwi. There's always going to be a need for care and protection and youth justice services in New Zealand. That is the reality. Like, there's so much that we need to change within the care system. Young people need appropriate and adequate access to mental health, counselling and health in general. They need access to education, many different things.
The 6 promises, basically.
Yeah, exactly. The 6 promises is what our young people need in Orangi Tamariki care and with care experience need. But I guess it's going to be a challenge to break stigmas associated with being
so hard
in care.
So hard. I also think that, like, specifically this promise that we're talking about today, safety and stability, talking about that anxiety that we have around, like, can we talk, or feeling like we constantly have to either run away or fight. I wonder if there was more stability in people's placements, that we weren't faced with like, oh, you've lived somewhere for 6 months and suddenly you're being moved out of your control and out of the blue. I wonder if that would help young people, because for myself, like I know, like I would have these people tell me, you're going to move, and because I wanted to be in care, like for me being in care was the safe option. And so I remember just any new placement, I would be like, okay, Sydney, this time, like, if you're good enough, they'll keep you. Like, if you're well-behaved enough, because obviously, like, watching movies like Annie or, like, all those, like, Matilda movies when we're kids where, like, teachers will adopt you, or, like, someone with money. Didn't get either of those. But, you know, it's like in that care experience mindset that someone will eventually want you if you're cute enough or good enough. And so I think that I wonder if having that stability of like, you have one placement or two at most if the first one goes wrong, but having that stability might prevent some of that anxiety around feeling like you're disposable. Yeah,
I would agree with that 100%.
Because for you, like, yes, you had your grandparents, but if you'd had one other placement that was like permanent placement, and then you would just do your respite care with your grandparents, what do you think the difference for you would have been?
I think I would have been provided with the safety and stability that every young person in care deserves.
So we've talked a little bit about your grandparents making you feel safe and stable. Like, what were the times when you were in care that you didn't feel safe, and like what caused you to feel unsafe?
There's only been 3 places where I have felt safe. That was with my grandparents, that was at a family home, and it was also with my old caregivers, the last placement that I had while I was in Aotearoa care. All of the other placements, there's either been other young people there who were abusive, but also a majority of my placements have either been where the caregivers were abusive towards me. And one placement in particular, there was, after I had left the care of this caregiver, I saw a news article that he was charged with sexual assault, and I guess I knew something was off about him when I was there. There were constant arguments between him and his partner, but I always had a gut feeling that something was off, and my gut feeling was right.
Yeah, abuse from caregivers is something that's like not always talked about until it is the worst possible outcome. Like a child passes away, and we hear about that, right, when it does get to death. But I don't often hear about caregivers being held accountable for the abuse they perpetrate on young people or children that doesn't result in death. And like, how do you think though that we kind of like weed out those caregivers who are like abusive? Because there's like, some caregivers are fantastic, but there's just not enough great caregivers.
I think we need to restart the whole conversation with our media. Like you said, we only see the worst case scenarios where a young person or a baby has died as a result of the abuse inflicted by the caregivers, but we never see, I guess, abuse is abuse, but there's different levels of abuse. We don't see the minor levels of abuse, but I think that as a nation we should be seeing the whole picture.
100% whole picture, I agree, because I feel like in media, mainstream media at least, when it comes to care experience, you either hear really bad stories, so a young person has died or committed a crime themselves, or you hear like this over like celebrated success story of like, oh my god, they're so great despite their upbringing, but we are a scale in between that.
There's no in between.
Yeah, and so I wish that there were more mainstream media sources of care experience young people just surviving and living, and like, what does that look like? What does a whole life look like after care? Yeah, I feel like media often makes care experience stories even more stigmatized, because they're like, you either have to be like this fantastic success story, like I don't know, like lawyer that's super awesome and like super smart, and you studied while homeless, and I'm just thinking of like all of these like movies I've seen on Hollywood, and you know, you were living in a homeless shelter while being abused and you still came out like this fantastic smart person, or you are now the criminal because of your care experience, or you were killed because you're abused. But we make up like a whole spectrum of just normal human experiences with care experience.
We do.
Generally, what do you think are some misconceptions that people who are not care experienced or don't know about our world, like what do you think they have about us? Because some of it's mean, like what they think about us, but
I guess the biggest one that's been floating around in my head for years is that we're not all criminals. Yes, we have done things that are bad.
Yeah.
But we have just had trauma in our early years of life which have led us to do things that are not right in the eyes of the law. I guess if we are asking for help, we are not crying wolf. There is something going on.
Yeah, I want people in the public to know that, like, kind of what we touched on before, that we're not criminals, but that we're also not like Orphan Annie, that we can be like on the spectrum between, that we're more than just like either the kid you want to feel sorry for or the criminal that you want to put away in jail at age of 10. Like, you know, I think that we are made up of hundreds of stories, and
we are not just.
Yeah, we're not just one thing. Like no one is in the world, but I do think that with care experience young people, you know, you just become a foster kid or you just become a naughty child, or no, we're so much more. Speaking of being so much more, what does the future look like for Ihorangi?
Yeah, well, I'm living back with my granddad. I'm also working, but I think down the track I want to move more into a policy setting environment. I want to do some study in law and public policy, and maybe political science and international relations. You as a politician is like, for me, is such a given that I know at some point in my future I'll have the option to vote for you. And it's cool, but it's also like scary to think of. Only because I have worked with you for so long, since you were so young. And I'm like, you in Parliament just makes me be like, I feel sorry for anyone who has to go up against you, because you'll just annihilate them. Like, I think that's so exciting though. Like, your brain is definitely in that space. Like, I see you being a really good policy maker, someone who's just like really onto it. That's so exciting. Well, maybe 10 years down the track, I'm
10 years?
Maybe running.
Oh.
I don't know, though.
Look, you heard it here first, guys. Vote for Ihorangi in 10 years. Tracie Shipton has done a lot for the care experience community and has made it her mission to be a support system and voice for change. She's also the main figure behind VOYCE Whakarongo, working as our CEO since 2019. Having seen members of her family as caregivers and then becoming one herself, she knows what tamariki and rangatahi in care need to be in a safe and stable environment.
My grandparents were actually caregivers,
Oh, wow.
My father's parents. My grandmother in particular hosted children from the community whose parents were impoverished, I guess, and children that she had a bit of a radar for children she thought were in stricken circumstances, is how she explained it to me. So she ran like this, almost like a day centre at her house, and would have the children stay for months on end.
And then your parents?
So my parents fostered a child, which was probably more by accident than design. They had their name down to adopt after having difficulty having a second child. They have subsequently had 7.
Yeah, I was going to say.
But the social worker turned up with a 10-year-old and said, we've got actually he was 8, we've got your name down and we're in this awful situation. And he was at the door and her heart broke. I mean, it's probably a reasonable response in the circumstances. Yeah. So she took David into our family and found out that he was one of 10 siblings. Oh, wow. And so she went on this journey. She refused to have him placed again because he'd had so many homes. And she went on this journey where she kept him connected to all his siblings, and they were a long way away from where we lived. So it was kind of a nice way to be introduced to fostering and the significance of families.
Mm. So you're like, how old were you when David came?
I wasn't born. Oh. So when I was born, he was already an established member of our family. So I guess that experience is probably a little different for me because he was there.
So just completely normal for you to have a sibling who's like not blood related?
Yeah, and I remember asking my mother, why does he have a different surname to us? And she said, well, because he was born, to another family, and explained. I mean, that was just so natural to have his siblings as part of where we went to visit. And I said, why don't you just change it? And she said, well, how would you like it if somebody decided to change your name? So they were kind of nice lessons for me to get really early on.
So how did you and your husband end up becoming caregivers?
We had a nephew staying with us for a while, and he, from his side of the family, and he returned home, and we helped out again with another nephew, actually, when things weren't going swimmingly well. And I had my sister live with us because my parents were overseas and she didn't want to remain living, and they were in Papua New Guinea. She didn't want to stay there. She wanted to come back and didn't want to go to boarding school. So kind of this environment of having a nuclear family never really existed for us. So
yeah. And so then from there, did you just start more young people?
That was probably a conscious decision that there was a child I found out about through someone that they were trying to get a placement for, and I remember being like taken aback that you wouldn't be able to find a home. Like, why would you just not do that? So I said, we will.
Yeah.
And it kind of went from there. We ended up registered with Department of Social Welfare, and I liked a particular age group. I really liked teenagers and pre-teens because there's not this big long line of people to take them. So, and I like them. They're interesting people. So that probably was our niche, if you liked, group.
And how, do you know how many young people you've cared for?
So I was working as a social worker, and then I went off to do my training, and prior to that I think we'd had 51.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And since then, in a different capacity, I've probably taken on a caregiving role as well. I mean, for quite a few more.
For you as a caregiver, it's interesting that you say you leave the door open, but you can't always be mum for everyone. I mean, 51 plus children. How do you care for young people or satisfy that need for them to feel love when you're looking after so many?
I don't know that there's no really simple answer to that. There are some children or young people who they gravitate back to their own families, and actually that was part of the job I really enjoyed, is keeping people connected with their families, and there's always safe members of people's family and building that relationship. And then you just become part of the wider network, so that that's much easier for them. It's a much more promising future as well. But in relation to the others who maybe not have those or may not have those connections, I think it's at the pace of the young person. Sometimes there's real intensity where they need you in certain periods of time, and then people go on and have their own future, but you can still have a part to play. I love it when people stay connected, and I stay connected to them because I'm interested, not because I feel an obligation to.
Yeah. So in all your time as a caregiver, what would you say like your biggest challenge was as a caregiver? It could be a specific young person that was the challenge, or like it could be just like in general.
Oh, I'd so like to name the person. Oh, no.
Fake name.
No. I think the challenge is a little bit about what you're talking about. How do you determine your relationship as they leave your care? Because everyone needs to be loved and feel like they're as important, and they are important. But they go on and have their other lives, but they still need you. And so sometimes it's just getting that balance of being available and being able to do that. And behaviours that are really challenging, they're difficult because no one wants to reject a child. No one wants to say this is something that we can't manage in this house, because everything should be manageable.
Yeah.
Like we're human beings and we should be able to, the whole love conquers all thing.
No.
Well, it's kind of true.
Yeah.
Like you want to be able to say, we can work it. And sometimes it just gets a bit tough. I've thought about what the biggest challenge is. It's Christmas time.
Oh, yes.
Christmas time with children in care is the biggest challenge.
Yeah.
When you're living in your own home in particular, because they never feel the same.
Yeah.
They just don't.
Oh, so many Christmas. Yeah, it's so true, actually. Like,
you can't make it work either.
No.
Like, you just have to roll with what you can.
It's so hard because Christmas, you've got your own emotions as a young person in care around like not being with your family or not having your own traditions or missing people. And then, in my experience at least, like then you're seeing like the bio kids get really expensive, nice presents, and then you've got like the pajama pillow. That's what I got one year, and I was so mad. But like you just kind of get presents where, for me, like my love language is gift giving. So when I give people gifts, I think it comes from my time in care because I really think about what someone would like. Because when I was in care, I would consistently get presents and I'd be like, do you even know me? Like, do you even know who I am? You've given me something that is nothing to do with anything I like, and I've never once mentioned this. And it just was another point of like, you don't belong here. So I think Christmas is, as a care experience person, like Christmas for me was also, or birthdays. Christmas and birthdays were the hardest times as well.
Can I talk to that?
Yeah.
Point?
No, not really.
I think it's this is a really interesting thing. When I lived at the children's home and we used to have Christmas giving, and I would go out and take each person's name, and I knew all the children individually, and I would buy for them and go on a Saturday or a Thursday night, and I did it over a span of time, and I would have them in mind as I handled every gift and did it. Now, it sounds very loving and kind. It was meant with the very best of intentions. Yeah. Do you know how many criticisms I had about what I thought? And one of the young people who I'm still in contact with said, do you remember that stink art set you bought me?
I know who you're talking.
Yeah, and I said, but did you see the other stuff, that stuff from Gordon Harris, all the things, the proper art? That was also part of it. Yeah, but I got that really stink art set. Well, actually, that was because I wasn't sure whether she was seriously into art or she just wanted so I got both.
Yeah.
And in trouble. See, sometimes you can't get it right, and I don't think people should be so hard on themselves, but I also think it's about if your mother or your father had bought you that gift that you didn't like the pillow, you'd have loved it.
Yeah.
It's sometimes about something we can't change.
Yeah.
And I don't think we should even, it's a time where people feel different.
So when you were a caregiver, because I know that you haven't officially been a caregiver for a while, but when you were, like, obviously we come with a full raft of needs, and some of them higher or more stressful than others. Like, what would you say were your mindset or your biggest tips on like how to be a good caregiver to young people despite the emotional or psychological issues that they're dealing with when they're in your care?
I think it varied over the years. I think it changed. In the really early years where I had people in our own home and the community, I just thought they just hang with us because that's kind of how things happened in our home.
Yeah.
There wasn't really there's no real delineation between the children who you've given birth to and the others. It doesn't mean they don't feel different or you don't feel different, but just everybody's in this and you just do it together. I met a young woman who lived with us for years and she's still in my life now, and her children are my grandchildren. And she told me when I was maybe 13 that it was the first time that she'd had Christmas present that wasn't clothing bought on a clothing order. And I just, that whole thing about remind yourself, would you do this with your own children? Would you? So I think that just hanging and being and just being part of what's going on.
Yeah.
But I think it's a lot more difficult to do that these days. Like, I think caregivers are much more difficult. It's far more streamlined, and there's a lot of expectations on caregivers to do things differently and to follow rules and to be inspected, all for the right reasons. But how would I do in that environment? Probably fail. I don't know.
You'd be too busy. But sorry, inspection. I'm not here. I'm busy.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of it. I tried just to hang out and be alongside young people and listen to them. They've got great stories. They've got great lives in front of them, and to be a part of that. But it is very different now. So I don't know. I mean, to answer you, I think people have a hard gig now. But I still think we should open our hearts up and do what we can.
So just one thing around like transitioning. So you've obviously dealt with young people who either transition home or they transition, like they might leave your placement and head to another, or you've received a child who's been in lots of placements. Like, how do you as a caregiver deal with your child leaving or coming to you from lots of placements? Like,
oh, look, I want to tell you the perfect answer because I know I've read all about it. It's the hardest thing I ever dealt with, but I knew I had enough nous to know never to let it show. The hardest thing was children who really desperately wanted to be with their really poor parents, who, I mean poor in terms of their response to them, their emotional stability, their environment. But I just knew, and I just know from, I don't know, the lessons I learned or something from them. Actually, it's probably the lessons I got from young people. Love is just so much more powerful than anything. It's so much more meaningful than all the things. And so I just rode that. I just talked all the time about their families like their families were in the inner circle of their heart. And I think that's what if I was to ever say what I did well, it's that. I think I just talked about their families in the most respectful way, because the circumstances that allow people to come into care are so varied.
yeah,
I don't think we should ever believe that we're immune to it happening to our children or ourselves. There's war, there's impacts of illness, mental illness, there's financial poverty, all sorts of things can impact, and I think we should never believe that it can't happen to us, and therefore we should respond in a way that we would want people to respond to our children, because they're somebody else's children.
Yeah.
And I talk about their families in that way, how I want them to talk about me.
If anything in this podcast has raised any issues for you and you need to talk, we recommend reaching out to a trusted friend or adult. Or you can call Youthline on 0800 376 633 to get more support. Or if you're in crisis, please call 111. Remember, there is no shame in asking for help. Next week on Whakarongo, we talk to another care experienced rangatahi, Lisa McLaren, about the promise of access to healthcare. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And be a part of a movement that advocates for change, one story at a time.